What's up, guys, and welcome to another episode of the Powerhouse Mentality Podcast. I am your host. I am Kaitlyn Smith, and on today's episode, I'm going to give you what I promised in the last episode, which was a podcast all about salt. All about how we need to stop fearing salt, because fearing salt and not consuming enough salt can actually lead to worse health outcomes than a lot of people can realize. And I'm going to start off with a couple stories from myself, my mother, my aunt, my clients, on the impact that not having enough sodium can have on an individual and on their health and on their quality of life. And then I'm going to get into what sodium, what salt does for the body. Why is it so important? Why is it essential? I'm also going to go into why does salt have a bad reputation? Because we all have heard like, oh no, I shouldn't have too much salt, right? So where did that come from? And then we're going to finish things off by getting into what low sodium or what not having enough salt can actually do to your body and how you can prevent that. So first off, let's talk about why this episode is happening. So a little bit of a backstory, and I've mentioned this on the podcast in the past a few times, but it's been a while. So my mom, I want to say about a year and a half ago, maybe closer to a year ago, was hospitalized because she had low sodium. She had hyponatremia, which is when your body doesn't have enough sodium and it disrupts your blood volume and fluid balance and causes a lot of different issues and can ultimately lead to death or coma if it's not properly treated, which is why she was hospitalized and hooked up to an IV. Now, here's how that all started. I remember one day I was driving. For some reason I think I was driving to the airport because I remember just being on the road to Pensacola, which I'm not going to Pensacola, which is about an hour away from me, unless I'm going to the airport. Or actually, you know what? I was probably picking up my wedding dress, which was like 2 years ago, so time flies. But I was heading out there, and I remember getting a text from her saying, hey, I think I'm having a stroke. I feel like I'm having a stroke. My blood pressure is out of control. I feel really weird. I have like numbness and tingling. I can't focus, brain fog, like all of those symptoms. And I called her, and we spoke about it. And I said, you know what, Mom? It sounds like you have low sodium or you're not having enough salt. And the reason why I really said that to her specifically is because I know her habits, her eating habits, her drinking habits, not alcohol, but like her water intake and stuff like that. And I know that she's usually somebody who's not eating enough food, and she just went on a kick where she started eating, more healthy, less processed food. She wasn't eating out as much. So I know that that's going to drastically lower her sodium intake because a lot of people get sodium and get salt from processed foods. All right, and we're going to bring that back up in the future, but let's just continue with the story for now. And she was like, "Yeah, my doctor put me on blood pressure medication and a water pill." Which is unbelievable because that combination is going to completely dehydrate your body and flush out all of the electrolytes that are essential for your muscular and your nervous system function. Okay, which is why she was experiencing all of these nervous system dysfunctions, right? So like she was dealing with the numbness, the tingling, neurons firing in a weird way. She couldn't focus. She had brain fog. Her cognitive performance was declining. Her physical performance was declining because she was getting muscle cramps and she felt weakness. So I told her to go to the hospital or go to urgent care and get blood work done because, again, it sounds like you have low sodium. Hyponatremia. A couple days later, she said they called her and asked her to come back in the hospital because she was below or in the danger zone of sodium. She didn't have enough in her blood. So it was causing a lot of issues. And if she didn't come in and fix the issue, it could get worse. She could have a stroke, go into a coma, die. It's a very serious thing. And I think that a lot of people don't realize how serious it can actually become and how quickly it can become serious. And I'll tell another story. It was happening around the same time because around the same time, that my mom went on that blood pressure medication and was prescribed a water pill at the same time from this doctor in urgent care. My aunt went to the same doctor and got the same prescription combination. So blood pressure medication, water pill. And my mom is stubborn, but my aunt is more stubborn when it comes to taking days off, not going to work, things like that. She will literally work through the flu. Like, she is a trooper. Like, God bless her. But, sometimes it's to her detriment in this situation, one of those things where she also was experiencing these symptoms. However, she let it get so bad to the point where not only was she hospitalized for a few days, but she was in very bad shape to the point where the doctors were saying if she didn't come in that day, she could have passed out, gone into a coma, and potentially died from how low her sodium levels were. So all of this to say that it can be very serious if you are not intaking enough salt, and it can get very out of hand very quickly. For myself, I have personal experience with this. I have had issues in the past when I had my eating disorder where I was eating a lot of whole foods, not a lot of processed foods, and I was purposely cutting my sodium intake because I would always see on social media, on news, online, that salt is bad and I shouldn't have salt. So I would never season my food with salt. I would always use those no sodium seasonings like Mrs. Dash seasonings that don't have any extra salt in them. And I thought that that's what you were supposed to do. I never took any sort of electrolytes because I thought like electrolytes are only for super athletes, which at that point in my life, I was not an athlete. I was just somebody who was very focused on building muscle in the gym, and I had an eating disorder as well, so I wasn't doing a very good job at building muscle, but I thought I was. And I was drinking a lot of water, so I was flushing a lot, but I wasn't replacing the electrolytes that I had lost through reducing the amount of processed food I was eating and not intaking any sort of salt. So I remember one day distinctly where I was on the subway and I almost passed out because I felt so lightheaded, so just out of whack. I felt super weak and I just had so many bad cramps. And I remember very distinctly because I was very afraid that I wasn't going to make it home. I did, and then I started to kind of do my own research and digging and realized that maybe I'm not intaking enough sodium. So at that point, I started salting my food and consuming electrolytes, and it made a huge impact. Now, in today's day and age, electrolytes and salt are of the most importance in my life. So like for me, as an athlete, as somebody who trains in her garage in Florida for 3 to 4 hours every single day and outside most days, it's essential not only that I'm consuming additional electrolytes, but also that I am salting my food heavily. So like I take pink Himalayan sea salt to every single thing that I cook. So if I'm cooking chicken, if I'm cooking steak, chicken thighs, rice, if I'm making oatmeal, I put salt in it. I put salt in literally everything, and I make sure that I have a very heavy hand with it because I know that low sodium is more detrimental than high sodium, and I'll get to that. It's also much harder for you to overconsume sodium versus underconsume sodium, assuming that you are a healthy individual, somebody who's on a fitness journey, for example, somebody who's not intaking a lot of processed foods. Now, if you're eating a lot of processed foods, the processed foods is where all of your sodium is coming from. So generally, if you're eating a crap ton of processed foods, like the normal American, the average American consumes a diet of 70 to 80% processed foods, which is ridiculous, but it's just the time that we're in. And for those who are doing the average American diet, you don't really have to worry about your electrolyte or sodium intake because you're getting plenty through processed foods. Now, is that a good thing? No, because the processed foods and the overconsumption of calories is adding more harm than anything. But when it comes to sodium as a whole, for somebody who is eating a lot of whole foods, drinking a lot of water, active, maybe even living in a hot climate, it's summertime now too, but even if you're somebody who's doing a ketogenic diet, a carnivore diet, or somebody who's lower in carbs, you need to really pay attention to not just your salt intake, but your electrolyte intake to make sure that you're not dealing with low sodium, low potassium, things that can make you feel not good and prevent you from performing at your best, not just physically, but also cognitive. So another example of this would be, I had a specific client who a couple of years ago, she converted over to more of a ketogenic kind of carnivore approach because she had a severe autoimmune. And I only recommend clients to do a ketogenic or a carnivore approach if they have a severe autoimmune, because they have so many things that they cannot consume that carnivore becomes a extreme elimination diet that is beneficial for about 0.1% of the population, and she's one of those people. So when we reduced the amount of carbs she was eating significantly, she was losing water and electrolytes and salt, right? Because with every gram of carb comes about 4 to 6 grams of water, which is why if you reduce your carbs, you lose weight on the scale. It's not body fat that you're losing. Low carb is not magical. Keto is not magical. You're literally just losing water, because that's what happens. Carbs act as like a sponge. So when you eat carbs, they absorb water, which could reflect on the scale, right? If you're eating more carbs one day, you might be a little bit up in weight the next day, which doesn't mean that carbs cause fat gain. They just may cause a little bit of water retention, but that's completely normal and it equalizes. So if somebody's cutting their carbs dramatically, which is why people think that keto or carnivore is magical, because they lose a dramatic amount of weight, but it's all water weight. And it's usually a problem because people have what they call the keto flu, and they contribute it to, oh, I'm just eating less carbs and my body needs to adapt. When in all reality, it's low sodium. It's dehydration. It's your body saying, hey, we just lost a ton of electrolytes and I'm not able to function properly and I need more. But most people don't recognize that. And I remember about a week into this approach, she was like, oh, I'm probably just adapting to the low carbs, because she felt like crap. She had some brain fog. She had like a dull headache. She just didn't feel right. And another symptom is no matter how much water she drank, she still felt thirsty. And I think that a lot of people have been there. And that's a huge sign that you just need more electrolytes, because your fluid balance is off. And you keep drinking water, and that actually makes it worse, because more water is going to dilute your blood a little bit more, which is not beneficial in that scenario. So we added in electrolytes in the form of LMNT, and she started salting her meats. She wasn't salting her meats because, again, she was kind of living in that mindset of, I've heard salt is bad for you. And now, like 2 years later, I can go to her Instagram and see she's using, Redmond's real salt. She's always using LMNT. She's always salting her meats heavily, and she feels fucking phenomenal. And it was literally like overnight. Not even overnight. Like, she added in the LMNT packets and started salting her meat that day, and she said she felt incredible. It's amazing how so many people, myself included, when I was first a trainer, like when I first started training people, where you associate low sodium with, oh, my blood sugar's low. I used to have clients who, they'd be training with me, and same thing, where they were tracking their nutrition, they were eating a lot of whole foods, and they were used to eating a lot of processed food, so this was like a huge shift for them. And they'd come into the gym for their workout with me, and by the end of the workout, I'd be getting them a Gatorade or something because we thought that, oh, they have low blood sugar and they have to sit out for a moment. When in all reality, it probably would have been more beneficial for me to go into my fucking lunchbox and get them out a salt shaker and say, hey, take a palm full of salt, and I bet that you're going to feel a lot better. Now, like, if I were working at a gym, I would have packets of electrolytes for people to take when they were in that scenario. Some of my favorite, like I've mentioned on the podcast already, is LMNT, because it has 1,000 milligrams of sodium, which is it's the highest that I've seen in a electrolyte packet, and it's some of the most beneficial because you will know immediately if that was the problem once you have one of those, and it's going to solve the issue for you. Now, let's talk a little bit about what salt does for the body so that you can understand, like, okay, I hear all of these experiences that you've went through, Kaitlyn, and I hear the passion in your voice about salt, because I'm very passionate about salt, and I never was, which is funny. But why should I care? Like, what does salt do for me, and why is it essential? So let's get a little bit nerdy for a moment. And I know some people respect the nerdiness and some people might tune out for a moment, but I'm going to keep it as straightforward and easy to understand as possible. So that way you guys can follow along, because if you don't understand what I'm talking about, then it's not going to benefit you or add value to your life. So really three things that you want to think about when you think about salt and why it's essential. Nervous system, muscular system, and fluid balance. So for the nervous system, sodium is required for your neurons, which are your nervous system cells, to fire action potentials. Okay, now action potentials are literally just electrical signals that are necessary for the brain and nervous system to function. It's kind of how all of our different nerves and nervous system cells communicate. So action potentials are like them talking to each other and telling each other what to do in order for us to, contract a muscle, relax a muscle, or do a certain task. So sodium is required for those electrical signals to actually happen. All right, when it comes to why that's important, like I said, it's important for cognitive and physical performance because those neurons are telling our body what to do to perform a particular thing. All right, now when it comes to the muscles, those nerve impulses, right, those action potentials are essential for muscular function. So sodium and potassium, two electrolytes, cause muscles to contract and to relax. Now, if your muscles aren't properly contracting or relaxing because you're low in sodium or potassium, then that's going to lead to a reduction in your performance. You're probably going to have some muscle weakness or some cramping. And I'm sure a lot of us have been there where, we're on a run or we're doing a workout and all of a sudden we get a really bad cramp. It probably has something to do with fluid balance or with a lack of sodium. Now, sodium also aids in water retention in the muscles. And a hydrated cell is a happy cell because a hydrated cell is going to be able to absorb amino acids from protein, which is going to help with muscle building and repair. And it's going to, again, help your muscles perform better in the workout. And the third thing is fluid balance. And this one is extremely important. All right, so fluid balance is regulating blood volume by helping your kidneys retain water. That's what sodium helps with. It helps with regulating blood volume by helping kidneys retain water. Now, when you have adequate sodium levels, your kidneys absorb more water, which increases your blood volume and increases your cardiovascular function, which is a good thing. Now, without adequate sodium, say we're low in sodium, our cells become dehydrated or they become too swollen. They absorb too much water or they don't absorb enough. So fluid balance is off, which is going to negatively impact your cellular function. Now, this happens because sodium balances the right amount of fluid inside and outside of the cell. And this proper fluid balance plus blood volume from adequate sodium is essential for healthy blood pressure. So if you're consuming low sodium or not enough sodium, or you're consuming too much sodium, your blood pressure will be impacted, which is why a lot of people fear salt in the first place, because they think that it has a negative impact on blood pressure in the opposite direction. They think that, if I have too much salt, then I'm going to have high blood pressure, which, and we'll talk about this, in the literature isn't actually confirmed. There's a lot of speculation, but not a lot of solid research. So let's get into that. All right, why does salt have a bad reputation? So the FDA recommends that we get 2.3 grams of sodium every day. But science says we should be consuming closer to 4 to 6 grams and more if you're active, eat whole foods, follow low carb, some of the things that I was explaining earlier. The FDA says that low salt or eating less salt is going to result in less cardiovascular disease. But when you actually dig into the research, you find very low quality epidemiology that makes absurd assumptions. So when it comes to research, there's really higher quality research and then there's lower quality research. More surveys and things like that a lot of people like to point fingers at, and then you realize that it's like not as effective as it could potentially be. Now, high quality studies show that sodium intake didn't predict blood pressure. In fact, high sodium populations had a lower or a medium blood pressure compared to a lower salt population. Now, sedentary people who eat an ultra-processed food diet, like I was talking about earlier, somebody who consumes a lot of salt, through highly processed foods usually have worse health outcomes, but salt isn't the culprit here. The ultra-processed and sedentary lifestyle is. Now, the bulk of American salt doesn't come from a salt shaker at home, right? It comes from processed food. It comes from a fucking box. It comes from the fast food restaurants. So it's kind of like poor evidence through misused data, because in a lot of the studies that support low sodium, they're using populations that were more salt sensitive, people who had insulin resistance, people who already have pre-existing kidney conditions, and they were also using low sodium diets with blood pressure medications. So if you take a blood pressure medication, we know those things work for reducing blood pressure. So it doesn't matter really what kind of a diet you put somebody on at that point. They're taking something that is lowering their blood pressure. So then, of course, in the study, it's going to result in lower blood pressure. And the war on salt really began back in the 1960s, where there was a study done on rats where a scientist injected the rats with 150 times the daily dose of sodium, and it gave them high blood pressure. But that's kind of, controversial, because the thing is, if you give anybody a huge dose of sodium and increase their sodium by 150 times in one shot, of course you're going to have a spike in blood pressure. But that doesn't say anything about real life, right? That doesn't say anything about lifestyle. The biggest fear from salt, like I said earlier, is how it's associated with blood pressure. And there's so much evidence that supports how a high sodium diet can actually be super beneficial. So I'll just list a couple of different things where, like I said, sodium restriction appears to not just be inconsequential, but it looks to be dangerous for heart health. So there are two studies, and I'm going to put these studies down in the show notes below if you guys want to look into them. I know that most people won't look at studies, but, I might as well put them in there if I'm citing them. So a 2011 JAMA study found that people limiting sodium to 3 grams per day had more heart attacks and more strokes than those consuming 4 to 6 grams a day, which is where the science says 4 to 6 grams. That's where that comes from. A 2014 meta-analysis tells a similar story where mortality and cardiovascular events were higher in people consuming less than 2.6 grams of sodium per day versus people consuming 2.6 to 5 grams of sodium per day. So what that says is that the World Health Organization's recommendation of daily sodium intake is likely less than the ideal range for optimal heart health. So that's why low sodium diets can be really bad for your health, right? So it's a little bit scary when you look at it like that, because based on these studies, right, based on high quality research, we find that the sweet spot is between 4 to 6 grams of sodium per day. And that's just a baseline. Like if you're active, sweaty, you eat a low carb diet, you intermittent fast, you do some combination of all these things, then you probably need a little bit more. And a lot of the times you have to almost go off a feel, right? So there are some days where I require a little bit more salt because I sweat a little bit more during my workout, or maybe I drank a little bit more water, or I didn't salt my food quite as much. And usually some of the indications that I get personally is I'm thirsty no matter how much water I drink, I feel kind of foggy, or I just kind of feel genuinely fatigued. Or one of the biggest symptoms is I have just like a dull headache and just feel like I've been in the sun all day. That's kind of one of those big symptoms that I look out for in myself. But what happens with low sodium? Like, specifically what happens? Like, why is this a problem? Why does it cause issues with cardiovascular health if we're not eating enough sodium? So, when we don't have enough sodium, our body's going to release hormones like aldosterone, renin, angiotensin, and norepinephrine. And these hormones trigger the kidneys to retain sodium. And these hormones also increase blood pressure. This is why we see low salt leading to higher blood pressure. It's because of these hormones. We also see osteoporosis can be seen in individuals who aren't consuming enough sodium over time, because bones act as a sodium reservoir. So they hold on to sodium. They kind of like contain it there. And when sodium is limited, your body's going to take from that reservoir to use the sodium for things that are keeping you alive and functioning. All right, again, in that keto flu thing, where you think it's just because you switched over to a low-carb diet, when in all reality, it's you don't have enough sodium. So you experience things like brain fog, like fatigue, like headaches, like sleep disturbances, cramps, weakness, decline in your cognitive or physical performance. And the reason why I wanted to do this episode, again, is because it's touched my life enough times where I think that it's something that needs to be addressed. And the amount of times where I've had issues where I have a client who's like, oh, I just kind of feel weird. I don't feel great. And then I tell them to go on Amazon and order an LMNT sample pack, and they get their sample pack for like $13. And they take one packet of it, and they're like, holy crap, I feel incredible. What is this? It's salt. That's it. It's salt. So let's consume one of those every single day, and let's salt our food, preferably with pink Himalayan sea salt, just because that also has other minerals in it, and it's not just straight sodium. It also has a little bit of potassium in it. So salt can make a huge impact on someone's health and the quality of their life. So if you found this episode valuable, or if you found this episode relatable in any way, please share this with somebody who needs to hear it, because I promise that it'll make an impact on somebody's life if they're in the right mindset. And, of course, go out today and do one thing that's going to take you one step closer to where you want to be.